This was not what Oliver Cromwell had expected from Jerusalem. It got worse. In May 1649, some hundreds of soldiers mutinied and tried to combine forces in Oxfordshire. Cromwell rode hell for leather 50 miles in a day and caught them in the middle of the night at Burford. One of the prisoners, Anthony Sedley, locked in the church, expecting the worst, carved his name into the font. The next morning, 3 of his comrades in arms were led out into the churchyard and shot. Then, Oliver went off to get an honorary degree in law from Oxford. And he made sure that the mutinous soldiers were shipped off to a place where they could vent their frustration on someone else. "Angry, are we?" was his line. "Want to know who's to blame for prolonging the civil wars? Say hello to the Antichrist across the Irish Sea." The target of Cromwell's march through blood was an army of royalists holding out in Ireland in the name of King Charles's son. In fact, it was as much Protestant as Catholic. But in his conviction they were the legions of the devil, Cromwell was not about to make nice distinctions. At Drogheda, on the main road between Dublin and Ulster, he made it only too clear what he had in mind. There's no point sidestepping this horror, is there? This was Cromwell's war crime, an atrocity so hideous it's contaminated Anglo-Irish history ever since. But we need to get right just what this atrocity was. What it wasn't was the indiscriminate butchery of women and children. No eyewitnesses ever claimed to have seen any such thing. But what Cromwell did order, unhesitatingly and without any mercy, was in any case an act of unspeakable murder. At least 3,000 royalist soldiers were butchered at Drogheda. The vast majority after they had surrendered and disarmed. At St. Peter's Church, Cromwell had his soldiers burn the pews beneath the steeple to smoke out the defenders, who were incinerated in the flames. The general saw no need to hang his head about the massacre.
"We are come to break the power of a company of lawless rebels who, having cast off the authority of England, live as enemies to human society, whose principles are to destroy and subjugate all men not complying with them. We come by the assistance of God to hold forth and maintain the lustre and glory of English liberty in a nation where we have an undoubted right to it."
This is absolutely authentic Oliver Cromwell, and today it makes for unbearable reading. No, it's not the confession of a genocidal lunatic, but it is the confession of a narrow-minded, pig-headed Protestant bigot and English imperialist, and that surely is bad enough. Cromwell treated Ireland like the primitive colony he thought it was, moving the native Irish off their farms and using the land to pay his soldiers. But before he could finish his pacification, if that's what he thought it was, another piece of unquiet Britain rose up to mock him. For the Scots had invited the 20-year-old Charles II to come and be their king, and went to war on his behalf. Cromwell lured them into England in the summer of 1651, where the Scottish army found itself caught between two massively bigger forces. At the Battle of Worcester on the 3rd of September, it went down to a ruinous and irreversible defeat. Charles went on the run, hidden by royalist sympathisers, until he could get smuggled out of the country. So when Oliver Cromwell returned to London in the autumn of 1651, it was as an English Caesar, the like of whom had not been seen since the days of Edward I. If Cromwell was God's Englishman, it was because he felt in his marrow that England was God's true promised land. And the best thing that could happen for Britain was that it become as English as possible. The Stuart dream of a united Britain, of course, had been what had started the civil wars. Now Cromwell had ended them by making that dream a reality, not as a united kingdom, but as a united republic of Great Britain. But what kind of republic was it supposed to be? As much as anyone, Cromwell knew the country was exhausted from almost 15 years of war. It was time, as he said, to heal and settle. But this didn't mean business as usual. Surely God didn't mean for so much blood and treasure to have been spilled, only so that ungodly lawyers and money brokers could get richer. And that seemed to be the way things were going under the government of the Parliament, the keeper of the liberties of England, as it styled itself. It still sat as it had when its members had been purged by the army to allow the trial of the king to proceed, ridiculed by its enemies as the Rump. To Cromwell, the Rump was a monstrosity, a bastion of selfishness and greed, more like Sodom than Jerusalem. Worst of all, it showed no signs at all of wanting ever to close down. When it came up with a bill designed to replace old members and keep itself going indefinitely, this was the last straw. On April the 20th, 1653, Cromwell marched down to Westminster in the company of a troop of musketeers. Moses was descending from the mountain, and he was not a happy prophet. Well, at first it seemed as though the member for Cambridge might actually behave himself. Cromwell sat in his usual seat, he doffed his hat, he asked the Speaker respectfully if he might address the House, and he even commended the Rump for its care of the public good. But as he warmed to his task, the niceties were tossed aside, and he began to berate the astounded members for their indifference to justice and to piety. "I expect you think this is not parliamentary language," he said. "Well, I confess it is not, and neither are you to expect any such from me." The hat went back on. This was always a very bad sign. And Cromwell started to march up and down in the middle of the chamber now, shouting that the Lord had done with them and had chosen instruments more worthy of their calling. Now, some poor soul tried to stop him in full spate, but by this time, Cromwell was in exterminating angel mode and brushed him aside contemptuously. "You are no parliament," he bellowed. "I say you are no parliament." And with that, he called in the musketeers. The boots entered heavily, noisily. Parliament was shut down. This was a depressingly modern moment, a classic coup d'etat, in fact. It was at this point that Cromwell crossed the line from mere bullying to outright dictatorship. And in so doing, he undid at a stroke the entire point of the war that he himself had fought against the king's unparliamentary conduct. Cromwell liked to claim he was striking a blow against what he called ambition and avarice, but what he really wounded, and fatally, was the Commonwealth itself. This is the point at which Cromwell could have seized power, and everyone expected him to. But Cromwell wasn't working for himself. He was working for God. In Parliament's place, he would set up an assembly of men hand-picked for their piety. It would be an assembly of saints. And his language was very different as he exhorted them to go about their business.
Love all the sheep, love the lambs, love all, tender all.
But mystical rapture and politics don't go well together, at least not in Britain. And in a few months, the unworkable assembly collapsed, its leaders begging Cromwell to put it out of its misery. He duly obliged. Now there seemed no alternative but to take the crown, to become Oliver I. But this was still a step too far for a man whom God had told to punish the haughtiness of kings. So instead, he chose to become a Lord Protector. That had a good ring to it, authority, but not tyranny. He was king in all but name, but a constitutional sovereign, ruling with a council and a newly elected parliament. His great hope was for a settling, but the truth was that the Protector himself was anything but settled in his own mind about the direction he should take the country. Should Britain be righteous or reasonable? It was a civil war he fought over and over again in his own head. Squire Cromwell could see the virtues of a reasonable state of affairs. Given a little breathing space, the old world of the counties was coming ever so cautiously back to life. Magistrates were sitting at courts, gentlemen riding to hounds, war-damaged houses being repaired, children being married off, friends and neighbours asked to dinner. And not least, when some of those gentlemen were elected to the Protectorate parliaments, the old connections between Westminster and the counties, the secret of English government, were at last being put back together. But the righteous side of Cromwell fretted that this return to an older way of doing things was only too successful, that it was not so much healing as backsliding. Royalism by the back door. So in 1655, Cromwell turned his mastiffs loose. The major generals. It was their job to take righteousness out into the shires, the Protestant Taliban on horseback, muffle the bell ringers, snoop on the alehouses, lock up the fornicators, cancel Christmas. John Evelyn, ardent royalist and gentleman of letters, who grudgingly endured the leviathan of the Cromwellian state, was one of countless people who found themselves on the short end of the general's bullying.
I went with my wife to London to celebrate Christmas Day, Mr. Gunning preaching in Exeter Chapel. As he was giving us the Holy Sacrament, the chapel was surrounded by soldiers. All the communicants and assembly surprised and kept prisoner by them, some in the house, others carried away.
It was a public relations disaster for the Protectorate. The prudent Cromwell reasserted himself over the pious, and he got rid of the major generals in a hurry.